everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Hey, thanks for watching. In this video I want to talk about the normative ethical theory, consequentialism. So let me see if I can just set up consequentialism as a general normative ethical theory and then say some things about how it is that standard consequentialist theories have developed, and then also say some things about how they've responded to certain challenges from the other side of the aisle. The other side of the aisle, sometimes known as the deontological normative tradition or the duty-based ethical tradition, equivalently. Okay, so let me just do some stage setting. Consequentialism is a normative ethical theory, as I've noted. It tells us that the rightness of an action is determined, surprise, surprise, by the consequences. So you figure out what the good consequences are, and that tells you the right way to behave. Wrong action, or the way that we shouldn't behave, is going to be associated with the action, with the consequences that aren't good, or otherwise with bad consequences. So that's consequentialism. It's a very general theory, and it takes many different forms, as you can imagine. The most common form is utilitarianism. And if you're interested in utilitarianism, I invite you to look at my other videos on utilitarianism, in particular, John Stuart Mill's theory thereof. Okay, so consequentialism just very generally tells us that goodness is necessarily connected to rightness. Badness is necessarily connected to wrongness. So you bring about good states of affairs in the world, you've done that which is right. You bring about bad states of affairs, you've done that which is wrong. Okay, so in this way, the value theory, the theory of what counts as good and bad, determines the normative theory, the theory of right and wrong. For those of you who have some ethics background, or those of you who've seen some of my videos, I discuss these at greater length in some of my other previous videos. So I invite you to look at some of those, including my videos on John Stuart Mill and his utilitarianism, but you'd find these in my other videos on ethics and the history of ethics. But I'm gonna push forward here. Consequentialism in slogan form is promote the good, generally, and sometimes it's put this way, promote the best, because sometimes consequentialism has a maximizing feature to it. So you're going to find different consequentialists who say different things about this. Okay, we need to take a stand on any of them. Just want to carve out some logical space in thinking about consequentialism here. Okay, so how to think about consequentialism. Now, note that if you want to develop a precise version of consequentialism, you're going to have to define what good consequences are. You're going to define what the best is. So utilitarianism says that happiness, or the happiness of all, that's the way of defining what good consequences are. I'll set aside utilitarianism again here. I just want to just note that that's one way of going, but there are others. The consequentialist theory then is a kind of skeletal ethical theory, normative ethical theory, and it's the kind of thing that that requires further defining of the relevant terms. But once you define what's good, then you know what right's going to be. Once you define what bad is, you know what wrong is going to be, and there you go. You're off to the races. Now, consequentialists want to take a stand on whether it's the actual outcomes or consequences that matter to the rightness of an action, or whether it's the expected outcomes. There's a crucial thing about consequentialism that's worth noting and keeping in mind throughout. When you think about the theory, it's saying that when we act, we need to act in a way that's going to bring about good consequences. So in this regard, what we need to do is be thinking about something future to our action, at least in most cases. So we need to predict what the outcomes are going to be. We need to predict what the values of the outcomes are going to be. And that leads to a bit of uncertainty, because our predictions in many cases aren't going to lead to the values that we initially think that they're going to have. We can be wrong. And so this theory, consequentialism, then as a consequence, no pun intended, is going to have a kind of uncertainty built into it, at least in many cases. And so to deal with such uncertainty, some theorists, many such consequentialist theorists, are going to say that it's then expected outcomes that matter. And we need to be thinking about the expected values of our outcomes. By expected, we're thinking about what to expect in the future with respect to the outcomes of our actions. Okay? And so in this way, you act correctly on this view so long as you form the correct beliefs, as it were, or you form beliefs, don't have to be correct because, remember, there is uncertainty. So more accurately, if you form beliefs about the values of the outcomes of your actions, right, in a way that's reliable or reasonable, right, such that it would make sense to say, oh yeah, it's reasonable that he did that, even though the world ended up not cooperating in some cases. So in many cases, we're going to be thinking about our outcomes, and we're gonna choose the outcome that we expect to have the best value associated with it, and in doing so, we're going to act correctly. But in some cases, we're going to go through reliable procedures to determine the values of our outcomes, and then when we go to act, the world is not going to be our friend. It's not going to cooperate with us. And so the consequentialist wants to say something about how it is that we can act correctly despite the fact that we don't have certainty, despite the fact that the world isn't going to cooperate with what we expect to happen. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, is typical consequentialists want to focus on expected value. And so long as you do the relevant kinds of calculations correctly, are paying attention to the relevant features of the action such that you're in a position to understand as best you can what the outcomes are going to be and the values of the outcomes, what they're expected to be, or otherwise following the general rules that we have in place that the consequentialist says derive from its fundamental principle, you should be finding that correctly. Again, even if it turns out that the actual consequences turn out not to work out in your favor. Okay, so that's a way in which consequentialism very often develops. Now, there are those who want to say that the uncertainty is actually more problematic than the consequentialist wants to let on. And in many cases, the uncertainty plagues us because we have to act hastily, or situations are just so complicated that calculating is really out of the question. And here the consequentialist wants to say that it might be right that in such cases we're going to end up having to act with quite a bit of uncertainty before us. They think that they have a decent response to this. They think that we've learned quite a bit from experience, that we have quite a bit of practical wisdom as human beings that we've learned through the ages. We've performed all kinds of actions as human beings. We recognize that there are tendencies, right? The tendencies of our actions to produce certain outcomes with certain values. And so moral rules have been crystallized, as it were, on the basis of our experience, on the basis of learning from our experiences. And so the consequentialist wants to say that despite the fact that there is this unreliability or this uncertainty in some cases, perhaps many cases there's some degree of significant uncertainty, we can always bank on, or I should say, according to the theory, it's always going to be available, even if we can't always bank on in our experience, the following of moral rules. So in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the calculating is going to turn out to be quite irrelevant. And the relevant process that we have to undergo in determining what the expected value of the outcomes of our actions are, just going to be following the moral rules, following the rules that we learned from experience. Okay? So experience is a great teacher in this kind of way. So we can follow the rule in many cases. And the rule is the kind of thing that has kind of built into it, as it were, the expected values of the outcomes of our actions. Okay? So the consequentialist thinks that they have plenty of good responses to those who try to say that there's too much uncertainty, given the fact that the theory is future-based in this way. Okay, so let me see if I can say like a bit more about the theory, some of the ways in which it's developed. The consequentialist thinks that it's important that when we act, we bring about, as I've noted, good consequences. And it's not the actual consequences, but it's the expected values of the consequences. There's certain consequences that we can reliably expect to be good ones, and then we perform the action and hope that the world cooperates. But at the same time, they think that, generally speaking, those who have good intentions, good motivations, good character traits are going to be in a position to act correctly, because they're going to be in a position to follow the moral rule when relevant, or they're going to be in a position to do the relevant calculations, to calculate the expected values of the outcomes of our actions in the right kinds of ways, and there you go. But there's no necessary connection between the two. It could turn out that someone who's well motivated, who has very strong character, could for whatever reason end up acting incorrectly because they just don't reliably calculate the outcomes or calculate the expected outcomes of their actions. That can happen. So on their view, they think that though it's important to morality generally, that people have good motivations, good dispositions, good character traits. It's, probably speaking, not a part of the normative ethical theory that it include these aspects. The theory is focused on the rightness of action, and there's no necessary connection between having these good internal states, if you will, and bringing about good consequences. Okay, so let me see if I can just say a couple words about how they would respond to a couple objections from what I've called the other side of the aisle, the aisle that has it that ethics is more duty-based than the consequentialist wants to say. So these are deontological objections. And I'm going to do a video on deontological ethics next. So I urge you to watch that once you're through with this. But here's one way of running an objection to consequentialism along these lines. The deontologist says that there are restrictions on the kinds of things that we can do, and consequentialism doesn't properly account for this. So according to deontological ethics, there are constraints on what we can do to other people, but if consequentialism is true, then all bets are off. In some cases, we can do pretty horrific things to each other in the name of bringing about the best consequences. So this might involve, for example, torturing someone for the sake of, I don't know, finding information to prevent some bomb from going off that would kill several people in a building. Some deontologists want to say that you can't torture someone. It's absolutely forbidden. So the nature of the constraint is absolute here. In response to this, the consequentialist is typically going to say, well, not all deontologists want to say that the constraints are absolute. So you have to be an absolutist to accept that. The consequentialist objects absolutism, and so do many deontologists. Moreover, they're going to want to say that shouldn't the deontologist be interested in maximizing whatever values they think exist, say respecting people, respecting people's bodies, respecting people's autonomy. And that's why you have to say the constraint exists in the first place with respect to torture. Okay, so the consequentialist thinks that she has a good response to the deontologist with respect to thinking about these kinds of constraints. This is a very, very common challenge to consequentialism, and the move is, look, the deontologist has a certain value in mind. Don't they want those values promoted too? Okay. So that's my video on consequentialism. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will do a video on deontological deontological ethics next.